Welcome back, my friends, my fellow literature enthusiasts who, like me, crave that deeper, richer way of engaging with art. Today, I want to invite you on a bit of a journey with me, a theoretical journey, one that's less about reporting on a film as though it were real, and more about allowing ourselves to treat cinema as we treat literature, as a text to be read, dissected, and ultimately felt. Before we dive into this exploration of How to Train Your Dragon 2025, I want to gently remind you, if you find joy in these kinds of intellectual wanderings, to consider liking this video and subscribing. Not because it's some empty ritual, but because it allows us to keep building this small, thoughtful corner of the internet where we can wrestle with stories the way some people wrestle with poetry or philosophy. And just to be absolutely clear, what follows is not a review of an actual film. This is a hypothetical exercise, a critical, imaginative analysis intended for those who love to think deeply, to learn, and to find insights that might enrich the way we see both stories and ourselves. When I think about this imagined film, I can't help but remember the very first time I stumbled upon the idea of dragons in my own childhood. I was maybe 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on the carpet of my bedroom, reading a weathered copy of a fantasy novel I'd picked up from the library. The book smelled faintly of dust, its pages slightly curled, and within its sentences I found fire-breathing creatures that seemed at once terrifying and strangely noble. That was probably the first moment I realized that stories don't just entertain us, they awaken parts of our psyche we didn't even know were sleeping. And so, when I engage with this film in my imagination, I'm really doing something more personal than just describing plot mechanics. I'm tracing a conversation between the story's ideas and the ideas I've carried in my own life for decades. The imagined world of this story is one that balances the innocence of adventure with the seriousness of myth. It's built upon landscapes that are both breathtaking and intimidating, jagged cliffs bathed in fog, oceans that stretch endlessly into the unknown, forests that conceal creatures both magical and menacing. I think of it the way one might think of an epic poem. Every detail, from the soaring score to the flutter of dragon wings against the wind, feels symbolic. It reminds me of the first time I read Homer in translation, marveling at how the sea could be wine-dark, or how the gods themselves could be simultaneously petty and divine. In that same sense, the film feels layered, as though what we're watching is not merely entertainment, but the enactment of archetypes. The young hero, the wise mentor, the beast who is not truly beast but mirror. And of course, no exploration of such a tale would be complete without a glance at its narrative arc. The story begins with a sense of loss. The central character, someone who has grown up in a world where dragons are less myth than reality, is torn between tradition and personal longing. There is a grief here, a kind of unspoken mourning for childhood innocence, for a way of life that is slipping through their fingers. From this tension, a new quest emerges. One that is equal parts external and internal. The external is obvious. The need to face new dangers, new enemies, new uncharted places. But the internal is quieter, subtler, and therefore, to me, more interesting. The reconciliation of one's own contradictions, the attempt to make peace between who we were told to be and who we actually are becoming. I love how this dynamic plays out, because it feels so achingly human. Haven't we all at some point felt like we were living in two worlds at once? For me, it brings to mind that moment in my early 20s when I was finishing my degree in literature. On the one hand, I was expected to conform to academic rigor, to analyze texts with precision and detachment. On the other hand, I felt myself overwhelmed by emotion. Poetry left me breathless, novels left me in tears, plays made me want to live more fiercely. The world said, "Be objective," while my soul whispered, "Be vulnerable." That's the same tension I sense in the protagonist's journey. The dragons, in their majestic, terrifying beauty, become metaphors for those unruly emotions we're taught to suppress but secretly long to embrace. The narrative teases us with the promise of discovery, and along the way, there are moments of sheer wonder. One of my favorite sequences in this imagined film, if I may indulge in the act of describing it as though I had actually seen it, comes when the protagonist, after nights of struggle, first rides alongside a dragon not as master, but as companion. There is something poetic in that imagery, the wind whipping through hair, the horizon opening up, the bond forming not from dominance but from trust. Watching, or imagining watching, that scene, I felt reminded of the first time I traveled abroad by myself. I was terrified, alone, unmoored. But somewhere along the way, fear transformed into exhilaration, and the unknown became not an enemy but a companion. The film, in that sense, doesn't just tell a story. It stirs our own buried memories, reflecting back the times when we, too, learned to trust the unknown. Of course, no tale of this scale would be complete without conflict. There are battles, betrayals, and revelations that threaten to unravel everything the characters have worked toward. And yet, what makes these conflicts so compelling is that they aren't only external. The true battle lies within. The antagonist is not just some faceless villain, but a figure who forces the hero to question the very foundations of their beliefs. And this is where the story takes on a more philosophical weight. Because the hardest questions are never about how to slay a dragon, but about whether slaying it is right in the first place. Are we conquerors or are we stewards? Do we seek control or do we seek communion? I can't help but think of an old seminar discussion I once had about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We were debating whether Victor's true failure was his ambition or his lack of responsibility. Some argued that he was punished for daring to overstep his bounds. Others suggested he was punished for refusing to love what he had created. That conversation has haunted me ever since, and I see echoes of it in this imagined film. The dragons are not mistakes, but they are mirrors. They show us who we are, who we might become, and, perhaps most painfully, who we have already lost along the way. There are twists, too, moments that pull the rug out from under us and force us to recalibrate everything we thought we knew. I won't give them all away, but let's just say that the story is not content with keeping us comfortable. It wants us unsettled. It wants us to wrestle. And honestly, isn't that what the best stories always do? They resist our desire for easy resolution, nudging us instead toward reflection. I think of the final chapters of so many great novels where the ending is less about tying bows and more about opening doors, an invitation to the reader to carry the questions long after the book has closed. This film, in its imagined brilliance, feels like one of those works. But beyond its intellectual weight, what strikes me most is the sheer humanity at its core. There are quiet moments, scenes of laughter around a fire, of whispered confessions, of silent grief, that remind us that epic tales are always, in the end, about small human hearts beating in the shadow of greatness. I think that's why I find myself so drawn to it. It isn't just spectacle. It isn't just myth. It's a reminder that even in the grandest of stories, the most enduring truths are found in the smallest of gestures. A hand reaching out, a tear unshed, a smile breaking through fear. And so, as we prepare to dive deeper into analysis in the coming sections, I want to pause here and simply invite you to reflect with me. What are the dragons in your own life? What fears, what contradictions, what longings hover just beyond the horizon? And when you encounter them, do you seek to train them, to conquer them, or to understand them? That, to me, is the lingering question of this story. And it's why I believe engaging with it, even in this theoretical exercise, has the power to enrich not just our literary minds, but our lives. When I think back on how this story begins to unravel, I always find myself smiling at the quietness of its opening. There is something almost deceptive about it, like the hush before a storm. The first frames linger on a coastline at dawn, the light not yet strong enough to banish the mist that clings stubbornly to the rocks. For me, that imagery spoke immediately to the way memory often operates. Hazy, elusive, and yet carrying a weight of inevitability. You can sense, even in the softness of the moment, that change is stirring beneath the calm surface. The protagonist is introduced here not as a triumphant hero, but as someone restless and slightly out of place. They walk along the shore with an expression that seems torn between nostalgia and anxiety. I remember feeling an instant connection with that restlessness, as though I'd known it myself at different stages of life. Moments when everything looked fine from the outside, but inwardly there was an ache, a question that had no easy answer. The storytelling here resists rushing. It lingers. We see their gestures, the way they touch a fragment of driftwood and then toss it back into the sea, as though uncertain whether to hold on to something old or to let it drift away. That kind of detail is what I cherish most in narrative art, the attention to tiny acts that reveal whole landscapes of the heart. Soon after, we are drawn into the rhythms of their village life. The settlement is familiar and unfamiliar all at once. Wooden homes clustered along uneven paths, smoke curling from chimneys, children laughing as they chase each other between doorways. Yet there's a heaviness beneath the laughter, a weariness etched into the faces of the older villagers. Dragons, once integrated into their way of life, now seem like memories rather than daily companions. It's as if a golden era has passed, leaving behind echoes rather than presence. That sense of absence hit me powerfully, perhaps because it reminded me of times when communities I belonged to also shifted, like when I returned to my childhood neighborhood years later and found the playground abandoned, the once bustling corner store boarded up. Nothing had changed and yet everything had. Nostalgia is tender but it cuts deep, and that's exactly the sensation these early sequences evoke. The protagonist is soon confronted by a conflict that feels both public and deeply personal. A neighboring clan arrives, bringing with them stories of danger. Strange disturbances at sea, sightings of enormous winged creatures unlike any they've known before, whispers of storms that don't seem entirely natural. At first, the villagers dismiss these warnings, or at least try to. But unease grows quickly. And here, I find myself remembering the way fear can seep into a community not all at once but through small cracks, like water finding its way into stone. A rumor repeated enough times begins to sound like truth, and truth, once feared, reshapes behavior. We see people glance nervously at the sky, keep their children closer to home, and speak in hushed tones when the sun sets. The film captures this atmosphere with such precision that I found myself shivering, though not because of any dragon. Rather, it was because I recognized that kind of communal fear from history itself. Literature teaches us that fear is as contagious as laughter, and equally transformative. Amid this unease, the protagonist's role slowly emerges. They are drawn not only to the mystery of these disturbances but also to the deeper question of what it means to coexist with creatures that defy understanding. I love how the narrative refuses to make them into a cliché chosen one. Instead, they are flawed, hesitant, often doubting themselves. They argue with elders, push back against expectations, and yet also question their own impulses. Watching their internal debate unfold felt strangely familiar to me, because I remember going through something similar when I first left the security of home for college. Everyone around me seemed to expect certainty, a clear sense of direction, while inside me there was only turbulence. That contrast between external expectation and internal uncertainty is perhaps one of the most universal struggles, and here it becomes the emotional engine of the early plot. The first major turning point arrives in a moment of almost accidental discovery. Wandering near the cliffs one night, restless and unable to sleep, the protagonist witnesses something extraordinary, a dragon unlike any seen before. Larger, darker, and carrying an aura that feels both majestic and terrifying, it doesn't attack, but it doesn't retreat either. The encounter is fleeting, just enough for awe and terror to fuse into a single heartbeat, but it plants the seed for everything to come. I remember catching my breath at this moment, because it's staged less like a spectacle and more like a revelation. There is silence, the crashing of waves, the flicker of torchlight in the distance, and then suddenly this creature, half shadow, half light. It reminded me of the first time I read a poem that changed my life. A sudden recognition that the world is infinitely larger than I had imagined, and that I would never see it the same way again. From here, events accelerate. Rumors become alarms. The village begins preparing for what they assume will be an attack. Weapons are forged, alliances debated, strategies whispered. Yet the protagonist carries a secret. They know the creature is not the monster others believe it to be. This secrecy gnaws at them, and at times, we watch them wrestle with guilt, fear, and longing all at once. I was struck by how human this is, the way we often keep our deepest encounters hidden, whether from fear of disbelief or fear of ridicule. I thought of the journals I kept in my teenage years, filled with experiences and emotions I never dared share, convinced no one would understand. Watching the protagonist guard their secret felt like seeing a piece of my own younger self flicker back to life. As tensions escalate, relationships begin to fracture. Old friends argue, mentors express disappointment, even family bonds are tested. This is where the story becomes as much about human frailty as it is about mythical creatures. We see jealousy emerge, suspicion bloom, loyalty waver. And I think that's why the first half of the story feels so gripping. It isn't just about external dangers. It's about the way fear and uncertainty expose the fault lines within us and between us. Literature has always taught us that the monsters outside are never as dangerous as the doubts inside, and here that lesson feels almost painfully vivid. The next significant chapter unfolds when the protagonist finally dares to approach the dragon again. This time, rather than a fleeting glimpse, they come face to face. The scene is long, deliberate, and filled with silences that speak louder than dialogue. They reach out, tentatively, hand trembling, eyes wide. And in that fragile moment, something extraordinary happens. The dragon doesn't recoil. It allows the contact, as though recognizing a kinship that transcends fear. I found myself almost in tears watching that exchange, because it reminded me of how connection often begins in the most unlikely places. The first time I held my niece as a newborn, for example, I felt that same mix of awe and fragility, an awareness that I was being trusted with something beyond my comprehension. The dragon's acceptance feels like that, a fragile trust, a silent promise. Yet, of course, peace cannot last. The protagonist's secret is soon exposed. Others in the village discover the bond, and their reaction is one of outrage. To them, the dragon is still a threat, a symbol of everything that endangers their way of life. This clash between perception and experience, between collective fear and individual truth, is perhaps the most powerful theme running through this first half of the story. It raises the question of whether truth is something that can be lived privately or whether it demands to be fought for publicly. And that, to me, echoes through so much of history. Think of artists, thinkers, or reformers who first held a truth in their hearts long before the world was ready to hear it. Watching the protagonist stand trembling but resolute before their community, torn between loyalty to people and loyalty to truth, felt like witnessing that eternal struggle all over again. What follows is a series of escalating conflicts. The neighboring clan grows more insistent, claiming that these creatures are harbingers of doom, that they must be hunted and destroyed before worse calamities strike. The protagonist argues passionately against this, but their words fall mostly on deaf ears. Meanwhile, the dragon itself begins to reveal its own complexities. It's not simply a beast but carries scars, memories, and a story etched into its very body. There are hints, fleeting images, gestures, cries, that suggest a larger history, a narrative we cannot yet fully grasp. And this is where my heart raced most, because I realized that the story wasn't just about learning to ride or train a dragon. It was about learning to read a creature as though it were a text, to listen, to interpret, to imagine what it has endured. Isn't that what literature itself asks of us? To step outside ourselves and inhabit the other, however strange or unfamiliar. The climax of this first half arrives in a storm. Literally, a storm. The sea rises, winds howl, lightning splits the sky. The village, already fracturing from within, now faces destruction from without. Amid this chaos, the dragon appears, not as enemy, but as unlikely savior. It shields the protagonist, rescues others from danger, and proves in undeniable terms that it is not the monster they feared. Yet even in this revelation, divisions remain. Some see its actions as proof of kinship. Others insist it is merely biding its time, a manipulative beast not to be trusted. The storm subsides, but the tension does not. Instead, the community finds itself at a crossroads, teetering between transformation and destruction. And that is where the first half leaves us, not with resolution, but with trembling questions. Who can be trusted? What does coexistence require? Can fear be unlearned? For me, watching, or rather imagining watching, this half felt like tracing the shape of my own inner conflicts. I thought about all the times I stood on a threshold, uncertain whether to cling to the familiar or step into the unknown. And isn't that what stories ultimately offer us? Not answers, but companions for the questions we cannot escape. What lingers most for me as I recall the way the story carries forward is not the roar of dragons or the flash of lightning, but rather the silence that follows the storm. That quiet is so heavy, so thick, that it almost feels louder than the chaos that preceded it. The village lies battered, pieces of homes scattered across the ground, the sea still angry but pulling back, and in the center of it all stands the protagonist, drenched, trembling, but alive. Around them, villagers stumble through wreckage, faces pale with exhaustion and grief, and everywhere you look, there's the tension of eyes shifting, glancing not at the ruins but at the dragon who helped save them. I remember feeling the weight of that silence in my chest, because it reminded me of something I once felt after a long, difficult argument with someone I loved. The shouting had ended, but the silence that followed carried more danger than the words themselves. Silence is never neutral. It is a question waiting to be answered. In this story, that silence is about choice. Will the village cling to its fear, or will it dare to believe in something new? For a brief moment, it seems as though hope might win. The dragon's act of rescue cannot be ignored, and even the most skeptical elders hesitate to condemn what they just witnessed. Yet hope is fragile, and fragility often breaks under pressure. The neighboring clan, the ones who had arrived earlier with warnings, seized this opportunity to exert their influence. They argue that the storm itself was the creature's doing, that it orchestrated both destruction and salvation as a trick to win trust. Their words fall like poison into a wound that has not yet healed. And I thought about how often in history fear has been fanned by those who claim to know more than others, by those who present themselves as protectors while sowing division. It's unsettling to recognize that pattern again and again, whether in ancient epics or in the evening news. The protagonist, of course, refuses to let this narrative stand unchallenged. They speak out, passionately, about what they saw, about the dragon's courage, about the undeniable reality of its compassion. Their words are raw, almost desperate, and I felt myself leaning in, almost whispering along with them. But truth, as I've learned in my own life, does not always convince those unwilling to hear it. The community remains split, some moved, others unmoved, and many uncertain, torn between the comfort of fear and the risk of trust. It is at this point that the first great twist reveals itself. Another dragon appears. Not the same as the companion creature we've come to know, but something darker, older, and far more menacing. It arrives not with quiet curiosity, but with fury, its wings shaking the ground as it lands. The sight of it is overwhelming, and for me, there was almost a mythical resonance, like reading of Leviathan in scripture or of the Balrog in Tolkien, an embodiment not only of physical danger but of spiritual dread. Suddenly, the villagers' fears no longer seem baseless. The balance tips. This arrival forces the protagonist into an impossible position. Their bond with the first dragon has been discovered, mistrusted, and now is tainted by the assumption that all dragons must be alike. And yet, in their heart, they know this new creature is something different, a force not of kinship but of chaos. I was struck by how this mirrored the way we often struggle with categories in our own lives, how one act of kindness or cruelty becomes unfairly generalized into an entire group or identity. Literature often warns us against this flattening of the other, but in the face of fear, such lessons are easily forgotten. The battle that follows is breathtaking, not only in its visual spectacle but in its emotional resonance. Villagers scatter, warriors fight desperately, and the protagonist, against every plea from those who love them, takes flight alongside their dragon. The two are clearly outmatched, but the bond between them shines in those moments of struggle. Watching the dragon shield the protagonist with its body, seeing the protagonist risk everything to protect their companion, I felt something stir in me that reminded me of how fragile and fierce love can be at once. I thought of times when I too stood against something larger than myself, not because I was brave, but because I couldn't bear to abandon someone, or something, I cherished. The battle does not end in triumph. It ends in retreat. The dark dragon leaves, but only after inflicting wounds, physical, emotional, and communal. The protagonist is left injured, their dragon weakened, and the village nearly broken. Worse still, the neighboring clan seizes the devastation as proof of their warnings. They demand that the bond between human and dragon be severed permanently, that the creature be driven away or killed. The protagonist's pleas fall again on divided ears. This, for me, is where the story deepens most profoundly. It stops being simply about dragons and becomes about what it means to stand in faith when all evidence suggests despair. The protagonist, lying weak from injury, dreams visions of dragons long gone, of ancestors who once rode alongside them, of stories forgotten. These dreams are not exposition, but poetry, fragmented images, whispers of memory, flashes of fire and shadow. Watching them, I was reminded of the way dreams often come to me when I am at my lowest, cryptic, symbolic, but somehow carrying the weight of guidance. The protagonist wakes with a renewed conviction. The dark dragon is not simply an enemy, but a wound in the world, a creature carrying centuries of pain. And to heal it, one must understand it. What follows is, in many ways, a journey inward disguised as a journey outward. The protagonist sets out with their dragon, leaving behind the village that has all but abandoned them. They travel through landscapes more desolate and more beautiful than anything seen before, crystal caves where echoes sound like voices, tundras where the air itself seems alive, mountains that loom like watchful gods. These sequences feel mythic, almost allegorical, like passages from Dante or Milton. Each place becomes not just a setting but a symbol, reflecting the protagonist's inner turmoil. I found myself deeply moved because it reminded me of my own solitary journeys. Times I wandered far from home, convinced I was lost, only to realize later that those wanderings were necessary for me to encounter myself. Along the way, they discover fragments of an older truth, carvings on stone walls, songs whispered by hermits, remnants of a time when dragons and humans were not enemies but partners. The implication is staggering, that the hostility of the present is not natural, but learned, the product of fear passed down through generations. This realization is both liberating and heartbreaking. How much of our own history, I wondered, is built on misunderstandings we have long forgotten but continue to inherit? How many enmities persist not because they are necessary, but because we've forgotten the original wound that birthed them? The story builds toward its great climax when the protagonist finally confronts the dark dragon again. But this confrontation is unlike the earlier battle. There is less sword and fire, more silence and listening. Standing face to face with the beast, the protagonist refuses to raise a weapon. Instead, they try to understand. They recognize the scars, the pain, the loneliness that drives its rage. It is a moment of radical empathy, and it shook me to my core. Because isn't this the hardest thing of all? To look into the eyes of what terrifies us and to see not a monster but a wounded soul? The dragon rages, resists, nearly destroys them. But gradually, through persistence and vulnerability, the protagonist breaks through. They extend not dominance, not even alliance, but compassion. And in that act, something shifts. The beast's fury dims. The storm within it quiets. For the first time, it does not roar, it sighs. The visual of such a creature collapsing into exhaustion, lowering its head, struck me as one of the most moving things I've ever encountered in a story. The resolution that follows is neither neat nor easy. The villagers, upon seeing this transformation, are forced to reconsider everything they believed. Some rejoice, some resist, and many remain cautious. But a seed has been planted, undeniable and irreversible. The protagonist, once doubted and ridiculed, stands not in triumph but in quiet dignity. They know the work is only beginning, that understanding is not a single act but a lifelong commitment. And I think that's why this story resonates so deeply with me. It resists the temptation of a clean ending. Instead, it offers something more honest, the recognition that reconciliation is slow, fragile, and ongoing. The final scenes are tender. The protagonist and their dragon, now healed, stand at the edge of the sea where everything began. The sun rises, casting light on water that is no longer stormy but calm, reflective. The horizon stretches endlessly, a reminder of both danger and possibility. And as they gaze out together, I felt as though the story had come full circle, yet left me with more questions than answers. Isn't that what the best narratives do? They end not with certainty, but with an invitation to keep thinking, to keep feeling, to keep searching. As the screen faded to black in my imagination, I sat quietly, almost reluctant to move. Because I realized that what I had just witnessed was not merely the resolution of a fictional tale, but a mirror held up to my own soul. It reminded me that the dragons we fear most are often those within us, our griefs, our doubts, our unspoken wounds. And perhaps, like the protagonist, our task is not to slay them, but to listen, to understand, to heal. What strikes me first when I think of the characters in this tale is how alive they feel, even in their contradictions. They are not chess pieces placed neatly on a board, not archetypes ticking off boxes in a formula. They are messy, uncertain, and often as fragile as we are. That fragility, in fact, is what draws me to them, because fragility is the most universal human trait. Strength impresses me, yes, but fragility makes me care. The protagonist stands at the heart of it all, though what makes them so compelling isn't their role as hero, but their role as a question. They are, from the very beginning, a person unsettled by the distance between who they are and who the world expects them to be. I remember watching, or imagining watching, their early scenes and feeling a shiver of recognition, because I too have stood in that in-between place. They are not born confident. They stumble. They argue with themselves. They doubt their instincts. And yet, in every hesitation, there is also sincerity. That's what makes them unforgettable to me. The way they interact with the world tells us more about them than any single act of bravery. Their quiet walks by the shore, the way they trace the grooves of driftwood with thoughtful fingers, the hesitation before they speak, these details create a portrait of a soul wrestling not only with dragons but with identity itself. When they first reach out to touch the dragon, their hand trembles. That trembling is more beautiful to me than any moment of sword swinging or heroic speech. Because trembling is honest. Trembling tells me, here is someone who has everything to lose and chooses to reach anyway. I can't help but compare that to moments in my own life when I trembled, not out of weakness but out of love, out of risk, out of standing on the edge of something unknown. The protagonist embodies that kind of trembling courage, and it makes their entire arc resonate as more than adventure. It becomes an allegory of human growth, of learning that fear and love are not opposites but intertwined. Then there is the dragon, the companion, the creature who begins as mystery and grows into mirror. I hesitate even to call it a character, because that feels too small for what it represents, yet it is a character in the truest sense, a being with presence, agency, and evolution. Its eyes, more than its wings or fire, tell its story. The wary narrowing when first confronted, the hesitant blink of trust, the pained gaze when wounded, all of these gestures are as eloquent as any monologue. What fascinates me is how the dragon changes the protagonist not by speaking but by being. The act of presence becomes transformative. Isn't that often how relationships work in real life? We are shaped less by words than by the simple reality of someone being with us, staying when they could leave, returning when they could forget. That's what the dragon is, constancy made flesh. And yet, its constancy is never passive. It challenges the protagonist, resists them, forces them to earn its trust. In that resistance lies respect. I think about how, in literature, we often encounter creatures that function as symbols. Melville's whale, Kafka's insect, Shelley's monster. But this dragon feels different. It is symbolic, yes, but also deeply personal. Its presence asks questions rather than providing answers. Who do we become when faced with the other? How do we respond when what frightens us also beckons us toward love? These are questions that stay with me long after I stop thinking about scales and fire. The antagonist, though, is not the dragon but the darker presence, the wounded, raging creature whose arrival tears open the story. And here is where character becomes truly fascinating, because this figure could so easily have been reduced to villain. Instead, it is given depth, even if that depth is revealed slowly. Its fury is not without cause. Its scars are not decorative. They are records of pain, of abandonment, of betrayal. When I saw those scars, I thought of all the ways human beings carry invisible wounds, acting out in rage because no one ever asked what hurt them in the first place. This is what great storytelling does. It refuses to let us dismiss the antagonist as evil. Instead, it challenges us to see that even rage has roots, that even destruction is often born from suffering. That doesn't excuse harm, but it complicates it, forcing us into the uncomfortable but necessary space of empathy. I've had people in my own life who hurt me, people I wanted to label as villains. But over time, I came to see their actions were shaped by pain I could barely imagine. The antagonist in this story embodies that truth. It is terrifying, yes, but it is also tragic. The elders of the village form another layer of character that I find incredibly rich. They are not one-dimensional voices of tradition. They are human, torn between memory and fear. Some cling to the past because it is all they know. Others doubt themselves quietly, though they lack the courage to speak aloud. In them, I saw reflections of teachers I've had. Those who, in their wisdom, offered guidance, but also those whose wisdom had calcified into rigidity. Tradition, after all, is a double-edged sword. It can preserve what is valuable, but it can also imprison us in fear. Watching the elders navigate that tension reminded me that characters are never just individuals. They are embodiments of ideas, of histories, of generational burdens. The neighboring clan, too, fascinated me. They are not simply outsiders stirring trouble. They are believers in their own narrative, convinced that destruction is the only way to safety. That conviction makes them both dangerous and heartbreakingly human. Because haven't we all seen that dynamic in real life? Groups clinging to fear because it offers a false sense of control? When they demanded the severing of bonds between human and dragon, I felt the echo of every time history has tried to sever human beings from one another out of prejudice, out of misunderstanding, out of fear disguised as protection. And yet, amid all of these larger-than-life figures, what I remember most are the small, intimate relationships. The friend who stands by the protagonist even when the village turns against them. The mentor who struggles between disappointment and pride. The fleeting moments of laughter around a fire, of whispered dreams spoken when no one else is listening. These details remind me that even in epic tales, character is built not in battles but in bonds. One of the most powerful threads in the protagonist's journey is their relationship with doubt. Doubt itself becomes almost a character, an invisible companion that follows them everywhere. It mocks them when they falter, it questions them when they dare to hope, and it whispers when they are alone. I felt that presence so keenly, because doubt has followed me too, especially when I dared to pursue something that seemed beyond my reach. In a way, doubt is the most faithful companion of all. And perhaps the truest act of courage in this story is not slaying dragons or persuading villagers, but learning to live with doubt without letting it rule. There's a moment, late in the story, when the protagonist looks into the eyes of the darker dragon and chooses not to fight but to listen. That moment, to me, is the ultimate crystallization of character. Because what defines us is not our victories, but our choices. And that choice, to see the humanity in what others dismiss as monstrous, speaks more about the protagonist than any earlier act of bravery. It tells me that this is not a hero defined by conquest, but by compassion. If I could choose one word to describe the characters as a whole, it would be layered. Every figure, from the central hero to the most fleeting villager, carries more than one face. They are shaped by fear and hope, by grief and loyalty, by tradition and transformation. And that layering is why they feel real. In literature, I've always been drawn to characters like this: Anna Karenina, Hamlet, Sive, Okonkwo. Figures who are contradictions, who are both broken and luminous. The characters in this story belong to that lineage. In the end, what I carry with me is not the memory of what these characters did, but of how they made me feel. The protagonist made me feel seen in my own trembling. The dragon made me feel the possibility of trust. The antagonist made me feel compassion where I least expected it. The elders made me reflect on the tension between past and future. The villagers made me ache for the way communities fracture under fear. Together, they formed a mosaic of humanity, messy, complicated, breathtaking. And perhaps that's why, long after the story ended, I found myself thinking less about dragons and battles and more about people. About us. Because characters, at their best, are not inventions. They are mirrors. They show us pieces of ourselves we might otherwise ignore. And in that reflection, they invite us not just to watch a story, but to live it inwardly, to carry it beyond the page or screen and into the quiet moments of our own lives. What fascinates me almost as much as the story itself is the world behind the story, the whispers, the eccentricities, the quiet oddities of how this film supposedly came into being. I've always believed that art, like life, leaves little fingerprints in the margins, and those fingerprints are often far stranger, more luminous, than the thing itself. Sometimes when I'm reading about the production of classic novels or films, I find myself more enthralled by the strange accidents, the misprints, the broken cameras, the chance encounters, that shaped them than by the work they ultimately produced. And so, when I lean into this film's imagined making, what lingers most are not polished press releases but the odd, fragile, human stories behind the curtain. The first strangeness I recall hearing is that the earliest drafts of the script were written not in the typical sterile environment of a Hollywood office, but in a tiny seaside cabin where the writers supposedly refused to use electricity after sundown. By lantern light, they scribbled notes and dialogues, claiming that the flicker of firelight made it easier to imagine the dragon's world. I don't know if it's true, but the idea of it stuck with me. There's something beautiful about the thought that a story so drenched in flight and fire might have been born in shadows and silence. It reminds me of when I used to write by candlelight during power outages as a child, scribbling poems I'd never show anyone, simply because the dimness made my imagination sharper. Sometimes deprivation creates abundance. Another strange detail concerns the casting process. Rumor has it that one of the lead actors was not the studio's choice at all but was discovered almost by accident. A stage actor, obscure and used to performing in half-empty theaters, was apparently invited only to read lines opposite more serious candidates. But something in their delivery, hesitant yet alive, trembling with an authenticity polished performers lacked, changed the entire trajectory of the film. The director reportedly said afterward that the choice wasn't about talent alone, but about truth. They didn't act like they were in a story, the director confessed. They acted like they were remembering it. That line gives me chills. It makes me think of the way authenticity, even when clumsy, can outshine perfection. Then there was the matter of the dragon sounds. Most films would build them digitally, layering roars from animals recorded in controlled environments. But here, the sound design took an eccentric turn. The team traveled to remote locations, recording winds shrieking through cavern mouths, the groan of glaciers splitting, even the hum of metal bridges vibrating under pressure. These sounds, distorted and blended, became the dragon voices. I remember reading about this and thinking of John Cage, the composer who insisted that noise is music if only we know how to listen. There's something poetic in the idea that the voice of a mythical creature is built not from lions or tigers but from the strange, unnoticed voices of the world itself. One of the strangest accidents happened during filming in a coastal location. A carefully constructed set, a wooden village built with obsessive detail, was destroyed overnight, not by human error but by a storm that no one had predicted. At first, panic spread among the crew. Months of work were gone in hours. But when the director arrived the next morning, they stood silently for a long time, then said, "Keep it. Film it as it is." That storm, in its unplanned violence, reshaped the entire first act of the movie. The ruined set became not a setback but a beginning, a visual metaphor for the fragility of human life against nature's force. I love that. It's a reminder that sometimes our losses are the very soil from which stronger art grows. There's also a small, almost absurd detail about the costumes. The designers, determined to achieve authenticity, insisted on hand-stitching many of the garments using traditional techniques, even when faster modern methods were available. One cloak in particular reportedly took over 2 months to sew, using dyed wools imported from 3 different countries. And here's the strangest part. That cloak appears on screen for less than 15 seconds. 15 seconds. And yet, I think about it often. Because isn't that the essence of devotion? To pour yourself fully into something, knowing most will never notice? It reminds me of monks illuminating manuscripts, adding flourishes that no reader might ever see, simply because beauty mattered to them even in the unseen corners. A different kind of strangeness emerged in the editing room. For weeks, the editors struggled with a particular scene, the first full flight between protagonist and dragon. Every cut felt too long or too short, too indulgent or too abrupt. Then one night, one of the editors accidentally spliced in a fragment of discarded footage, shots of the sea rolling endlessly with no actors in frame. They watched in silence. And somehow, in that accident, they realized what was missing, not spectacle, but breath. The final cut of the scene lingers on waves and sky almost as much as on wings, a decision born not from planning but from error. I love mistakes that transform. They remind me of the Japanese idea of wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection. Even the music carries its own peculiar history. The composer reportedly refused to begin writing until they had spent nights outdoors, lying under the open sky, simply listening. Dragons belong to the sky, they said, and I can't write their music from inside four walls. Some of the score was recorded not in polished studios but in abandoned churches and empty warehouses, where echoes created strange, haunting textures. In one instance, the haunting sound of a cracked cello string was left in the final mix, because its rawness felt truer than perfection. That detail makes me ache, because it suggests that even flaws can be sacred. There's also a whispered story about the filming of the antagonist dragon scenes. Apparently, the animators began to argue over its design, some insisting it should be grotesque, others that it should retain beauty even in its menace. The compromise was unusual. They created two versions and overlaid them, so that depending on light and angle, the creature's face could shift, sometimes fearsome, sometimes strangely sorrowful. I love the poetry of that choice. It mirrors the way we see those we fear in real life. From one angle, terrifying. From another, tragically human. Perhaps the strangest fact of all, though, involves what wasn't filmed. There are stories of entire subplots written, rehearsed, even partially shot, that were later abandoned not because they failed but because they revealed too much. The director apparently believed in leaving silences, in allowing mystery to linger. One scene reportedly showed a dream sequence of dragons communicating in something like song. But it was cut, because, as the director said, it explained too much. That decision feels almost literary, like the way Melville leaves swaths of Moby Dick enigmatic, or the way Emily Dickinson refuses to resolve her metaphors. Sometimes restraint is the greatest gift an artist can offer. Another peculiar thread runs through the production diaries: birds. Crew members noticed that, in several locations, birds would gather unexpectedly whenever dragon scenes were filmed. Seagulls circling overhead, crows lining rooftops, even swans floating silently nearby. Superstition grew around these sightings. Some claimed it was coincidence, others whispered that it was the story itself, drawing the natural world into its orbit. I don't know what I believe, but the image delights me, the idea that the world itself, feathered and watchful, leaned closer to witness the telling. And then there's the matter of the film's ending. I heard that several versions were filmed, some darker, some brighter. In one, the dragon flies away, never to return. In another, the protagonist dies, leaving the dragon alone. Ultimately, though, the chosen ending was one of quiet companionship at the shoreline. But because test audiences, when shown the darker cuts, reportedly sat in stunned silence afterward, not moved, but shattered. The director, reflecting on this, decided the world had enough endings that break us. They wanted one that bent but didn't break. That decision feels almost like an ethical choice, as though storytelling carries not just aesthetic weight but moral responsibility. What I find most fascinating in all of these behind-the-scenes details is not simply the oddness of them, the lantern-lit writing, the storm-destroyed set, the birds circling uninvited, but what they reveal about art itself. They show that stories are never made cleanly. They are messy, shaped by accidents, arguments, obsessions, and sheer chance. They remind me of the way our own lives unfold, not as neat arcs, but as tangled threads, where even the strangest mistakes sometimes lead us to beauty. In the end, the strangest fact might be this: The film feels less like it was made and more like it was found. As though the creators stumbled onto something larger than themselves, something that wanted to be told, and all they could do was follow. That feeling that art is not entirely ours but something we borrow, glimpse, and then release, is one I've carried with me for years. And perhaps that's why I find myself returning, again and again, not only to the story on screen but to the whispered stories of how it came to be. Because in those whispers, in those accidents and oddities, I see the truth I believe most deeply, that beauty is born not from control, but from surrender. What stays with me most, after sitting through the film, are not just the sweeping flights or the flashes of dragon fire, but the quieter tremors, the little earthquakes of meaning that ripple beneath the surface of its grand spectacle. When I try to recall it, certain moments come to me not in order but in sensations. A tightening in my chest, a lingering ache in my throat, a silence that seemed to stretch longer than silence should. And so, when I think critically about its events, I find myself less cataloging them than living them all over again, as though the story were not something I watched but something I walked through. One of the earliest events that comes to mind is the storm that shatters the fragile sense of peace we're offered in the opening. This storm isn't just weather, it's almost a character in itself. The film frames it with unusual intimacy, camera close on trembling hands, on breath fogging in the cold air, on torches sputtering into darkness. And then, in wide, sweeping shots, it shows the storm swallowing entire structures, erasing what once seemed permanent. From a critical lens, this event is more than spectacle, it's the first declaration of theme. Permanence, the film seems to whisper, is an illusion. We build villages, homes, bonds, stories, and yet, like sandcastles at the edge of the tide, they are always at risk. I remember how, as I watched, I felt a strange recognition stir in me. It reminded me of childhood moments when I thought certain things, friendships, family rituals, even the house I grew up in, would last forever, only to discover how swiftly they could vanish. That storm, cinematically, works on multiple levels. It advances plot by forcing the characters into new terrains, but it also acts as a mirror to our own lives. It tells us, gently but firmly, that we cannot mistake comfort for permanence. From this devastation arises one of the film's most significant events, the first genuine bond between human and dragon. It unfolds slowly, almost hesitantly, in a series of encounters where suspicion gradually thaws into curiosity. What strikes me, looking critically, is the way the film resists the cliché of instant trust. Instead, it lingers on hesitation, the protagonist reaching out, then pulling back, the dragon lowering its head, then snapping it back up defensively. In these tiny negotiations, trust is built not as a grand gesture but as a fragile accumulation of moments. Here lies one of the film's most profound resonances. It argues that trust is not lightning but water. It doesn't strike, it seeps, drop by drop, until the ground is saturated. This is why the bond feels so earned, so deeply affecting. It mirrors how in our own lives, whether with people or with ourselves, trust is not one decision but thousands of small ones. Watching it unfold, I found myself recalling how long it took me to trust certain people in my life, how many tiny, seemingly inconsequential moments added up to something profound. That's why this event carries such weight. It's not only about dragon and rider, but about what it means for any of us to risk being vulnerable. Another key moment arrives when conflict sharpens, not between dragon and human, but among humans themselves. There's a scene where the community, fractured by fear, turns against the protagonist. They accuse, they doubt, they project their terror outward. From a narrative perspective, it's a turning point. From a critical perspective, it's a study in how fear corrodes collective bonds. What chills me about this scene is how timeless it feels. We've seen this throughout history, fear of the unknown leading to suspicion, persecution, division. The film captures this truth with painful clarity, showing how easily human beings will fracture under the weight of uncertainty. And yet, what elevates this scene beyond simple commentary is the way it's staged. The camera doesn't stay at a distance, surveying the mob. It moves in close, capturing individual faces contorted by fear, shame, anger. It forces us to see them not as a faceless crowd but as individuals, each caught in the snare of their own insecurities. To me, this transforms the scene from accusation into empathy. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it asks us to see its roots. In that way, the film challenges us not to fall into the very trap it depicts, condemning others without understanding them. Later, one of the most extraordinary events unfolds during a mid-battle sequence, when the protagonist chooses mercy over violence. The dragon, cornered and vulnerable, becomes a target for destruction. The logical heroic action, by conventional storytelling, would be to slay it and claim victory. But instead, the protagonist lowers their weapon, an act that visually echoes earlier gestures of trust. This moment resonates critically because it subverts expectation. It redefines heroism not as dominance but as restraint. I still remember the hush in the theater during that scene, the way even the air seemed to still. It felt like a communal intake of breath. And I think it's because the scene asked something radical of us, to believe that power is not always about action, but sometimes about inaction, about refusal. In literature, I often think of moments like this as akin to Antigone's defiance, or Lear's final quietness. They carry the weight of paradox. To refuse to strike becomes the most powerful strike of all. Then, of course, there is the great twist, when what we thought was the true enemy is revealed to be something else entirely. I won't recount the specifics in a spoilery way, but critically speaking, the brilliance of this twist lies not in shock value but in thematic layering. The supposed enemy is unmasked as a victim of its own wounds, manipulated and trapped. Suddenly, the binary collapses. Predator becomes prey, monster becomes mirror. What this accomplishes is profound. It denies us the comfort of simple morality. I think often about how stories, especially blockbuster films, tend to crave simplicity. This is good, that is bad, here's your resolution. But this story dares to muddy the waters, to suggest that our enemies might be suffering, that conflict might stem less from evil than from pain. It resonates with me personally because I've known people in my own life who seemed cruel or unreachable, only to discover later that their cruelty was a shield, their anger a symptom. This event, for me, embodies the film's deepest moral conviction, that empathy is not weakness but vision. The climax, when human and dragon soar into battle not against each other but alongside one another, feels almost operatic in scale. Yet, critically, what makes it work is not the spectacle but the intimacy. We've been prepared for this moment not through grand speeches but through the accumulation of small, fragile gestures of trust earlier on. So when they finally move in perfect sync, it feels inevitable, not forced. This event is more than an action sequence. It's the embodiment of the film's central metaphor, that true power comes from unity, not domination. What lingers after the climax is the resolution. And here I think the film achieves something remarkable. Rather than ending with triumph alone, it leaves us with quiet, with the recognition that peace is fragile, temporary, always under threat. The protagonist and dragon remain together, yes, but there's an ache in the air, a knowledge that nothing is permanent. This ending, from a critical perspective, aligns the story not with fairy tales but with elegies. It doesn't say, happily ever after, it says, for now. And in that conditional, in that fragile temporal phrase, lies its truth. Thematically, this choice resonates deeply. It reminds us that relationships, victories, even moments of harmony, are not permanent trophies but living, breathing things that must be tended. That's why the film haunts me, not because it gave me a clean resolution, but because it reminded me of the impermanence of all resolutions. When I step back and consider the reception of these events, I think this is why the film resonates so powerfully with audiences, especially those inclined toward literature and critical thought. It doesn't just entertain, it interrogates. It asks us to consider trust, fear, mercy, and impermanence not as abstract ideas but as lived experiences. It insists that stories can be mirrors, reflecting not just the fantasies we crave but the truths we resist. And perhaps that's why, when I left the theater, I didn't feel simply exhilarated. I felt quiet, sobered, almost humbled. The events of the story lingered not like fireworks but like echoes. They followed me into my dreams, into my waking conversations, into the way I looked at people the next day. That, to me, is the mark of great art. Not that it entertains us for 2 hours, but that it alters the texture of our perception long after the credits fade. So when I revisit these events critically, the storm, the first fragile bond, the fracturing of the community, the refusal to strike, the revelation of the true enemy, the climactic union, the bittersweet ending, I see not just a sequence of plot points but a meditation on what it means to be human. Each event builds on the last, not only narratively but thematically, weaving a tapestry of fragility, trust, empathy, and impermanence. And in that weaving, the film achieves something rare. It becomes less about dragons and battles than about us, about the way we stumble and strive in our own fragile, impermanent lives. When I think about the magic of this film, my mind doesn't only go to what I saw on screen, but also to what I imagine was happening just outside the frame, in the spaces where cameras and wires and worried crew members lived. It's funny, isn't it? How sometimes the most awe-inspiring moments in cinema, the ones that make us gasp or laugh or even cry, are stitched together from countless tiny, awkward, unglamorous moments. Someone trips over a cable. Someone else waits in the cold for hours, balancing a light just so. A sound technician holds their breath during a crucial take because even a cough might ruin it. And later, editors piece together fragments that in isolation look absurd, but together bloom into something breathtaking. That's the world I want to invite you into, the messy, beautiful, behind-the-scenes story of how this film came to life. And though we'll never fully know every whispered conversation, every accident that became genius, or every sleepless night that shaped the final cut, what we do know, those scattered production insights and fun facts, already paints a picture that is as compelling as the film itself. One of the first things that always fascinates me about filmmaking is location. For this production, the choice of landscape was no accident. The sweeping cliffs, endless skies, and jagged coasts we saw weren't conjured out of thin air. They were inspired by painstaking research trips where the crew traveled to remote places, sketching and photographing, soaking in the kind of wild beauty that cannot be fabricated in a studio. I imagine the directors standing on some windswept cliffside, their jackets pulled tight against the cold, pointing out into the fog and saying, "Yes, this is it. This is where our story breathes." There's something deeply romantic about that. The idea that long before cameras roll, artists wander the earth like pilgrims, seeking the exact curve of a coastline that will whisper truth into their story. And yet, despite all that natural inspiration, so much of the film is born from wires and green screens. The dragons, for example, weren't real, of course, but the process of making them feel real is a story in itself. Animators studied not only animals we expect, like bats, lizards, birds of prey, but also surprising ones. The playfulness of otters, the loyalty of dogs, the grace of dolphins. These details found their way into the creatures' movements. One animator supposedly confessed that they even mimicked their cat's expressions frame by frame. Can you imagine? Somewhere in an ordinary apartment, a cat stretches lazily on a windowsill, and that stretch becomes the blueprint for one of the most majestic creatures we see flying across the screen. That, to me, is the kind of alchemy filmmaking thrives on. The extraordinary born from the utterly ordinary. There's also a story about sound design that always makes me smile. You know those roars, growls, and strange vocalizations that fill the air? Many of them weren't what you'd expect. Yes, some were synthesized, but many came from layering real animal noises in peculiar ways. I read about how one sound designer mixed recordings of elephants with the chirps of birds, slowed down whale songs, and even tossed in recordings of growling dogs. And then there was the more playful experimentation. Someone crumpling aluminum foil became the sound of fire crackling. Someone else dragging a chair across a wooden floor became the deep groan of a dragon taking flight. Isn't it wonderful to think that every time you hear a dragon roar, you might also be hearing a kitchen chair protesting against the floorboards? And yet, the fun isn't only technical. Human stories from the production always strike me as the most endearing. There's an anecdote about one of the actors who, while practicing a particularly emotional monologue in the recording booth, became so swept up in the moment that they accidentally knocked over the microphone stand. Instead of cutting, the director let them continue, and later that little burst of clumsiness actually informed the character's body language in animation. What began as a mistake bloomed into authenticity. It's a small reminder that in art, flaws often become the seeds of truth. Then there's the sheer scale of collaboration. Think about it, hundreds, maybe thousands, of people working for years. Some paint only skies, endlessly shading clouds until they look just right. Others focus only on how leather straps look in the torchlight. Someone's whole job might be to design how rain falls in one 3-second shot. When you think about it that way, every frame becomes a cathedral, built not by one genius but by many hands, each brick carefully placed. For me, that's one of the most moving insights about film production, the invisibility of labor. Most of us leave the theater talking about the stars or the director, forgetting the countless others whose fingerprints are woven into every detail. And yet, if you know how to look, you can see them. I also love the stories of playful chaos, because let's be honest, sets and studios are not always serious places. Apparently, one day during production, the animators slipped in a joke dragon, a ridiculous little creature with googly eyes and flapping wings, into a test render. When the director reviewed the sequence, expecting something majestic, they burst into laughter at the absurdity. That dragon never made it into the final cut, of course, but the energy of that playfulness, the reminder not to take themselves too seriously, lingered in the team's work. I think sometimes the best art comes from those moments of levity, when people allow themselves to be silly. Another curious fact concerns lighting. The film has such a distinctive glow, moody, magical, at times almost painterly. That didn't happen by accident. The lighting team reportedly studied classic painters, Rembrandt, Turner, Caravaggio, to learn how they manipulated shadow and light. So when you see a dragon silhouetted against a golden sky, or a flickering torch casting uneven shadows across stone walls, you're not just watching digital rendering, you're watching echoes of centuries-old artistic traditions woven into pixels. It makes me think about how art is always a conversation across time. And yet, for all the artistry, there were real challenges too. At one point, a massive portion of the animation files was accidentally corrupted. Imagine years of work nearly vanishing overnight. Panic rippled through the studio, and for a few tense days, the team thought they might have lost entire sequences forever. But here's the miracle. Because of a quirk in the backup system, one junior technician happened to have saved a near-complete version of the files at home, almost by accident. That backup became the foundation for restoring the lost footage. I find something almost mythic in that story, the fate of a massive film hanging not on high technology, but on the foresight of one relatively unknown technician. It's like the real-world echo of the film's themes, small, overlooked gestures turning into acts of salvation. Then there are the quirks of performance. Voice acting, especially, brings out the strangest behind-the-scenes tales. One actor, tasked with voicing a dragon-like growl, reportedly drank 3 cans of soda and burped into the microphone until they got the perfect sound. Another kept improvising lines that weren't in the script, and those ad-libs ended up becoming some of the film's most memorable moments. There's something wonderful about that, how spontaneity sneaks its way into the most meticulously planned productions. And of course, there's the music. The score is so stirring, but behind it lies months of experimentation. At one point, the composer tested bagpipes, fiddles, and even unusual percussion instruments to capture the texture of the film's world. The final soundscape feels seamless, but it's stitched from 1,000 experiments, some of which must have sounded absurd in isolation. I imagine the crew sitting around, listening to a dragon's flight underscored by bagpipes, shaking their heads and laughing before finally finding the right blend. What makes these behind-the-scenes stories so compelling is that they remind us of the humanity beneath the art. We often think of films as polished products, but in truth, they are messy, fragile, vulnerable things, born of accidents, compromises, laughter, crises, and a million invisible hands. The fun facts, the odd anecdotes, the near catastrophes, they are all proof that art is alive long before it reaches us. And maybe that's what I cherish most. The reminder that cinema is not magic conjured out of nowhere, but the sum of countless human gestures. Every time I rewatch, I don't only see dragons soaring or battles raging. I also see the cat on the animator's windowsill, the sound designer crumpling foil, the junior technician quietly saving files on their hard drive, the actor knocking over a microphone stand. I see the whole invisible chorus of people whose labor and laughter made the story possible. And isn't that, in some way, its own kind of magic? There are films where the story carries you, where the characters draw you in, where the themes stretch into your heart. And then there are films where the setting itself breathes so deeply, so vividly, that it feels like a character in its own right. That was my experience here. Long after the credits rolled, I kept returning not only to the narrative but to the spaces in which it unfolded, the jagged cliffs, the roaring seas, the shadowed forests, the glowing caverns. These weren't backdrops. They weren't decorative paintings hung behind actors to give us a sense of place. They were living, pulsing worlds that shaped every choice, every emotion, every moment of tension. I often think about setting as memory. Maybe you felt this too, how certain landscapes cling to us long after we've left them. The damp smell of pine trees from a childhood hike, the orange glow of a street lamp outside your bedroom window, the sound of rain tapping against a tin roof. These places shape our inner lives. And cinema, when it's at its best, recreates that sensation. It gives us spaces so alive that they lodge in our memory like places we've actually been. That was the sensation I carried from this film. The opening sequences drew me immediately into a world both familiar and strange. The coastline, with its towering cliffs and restless seas, reminded me of childhood trips to the edge of the Atlantic, where the horizon always seemed endless, almost frightening in its vastness. And yet here, that vastness carried not only fear but possibility. The waves seemed to whisper of journeys not yet taken, of skies waiting to be filled with wings. The cinematography lingered on that horizon, those long, sweeping shots that let our eyes stretch outward before quickly pulling us down into the small, intimate details of village life. That contrast, the immensity of the natural world versus the intimacy of human community, became, for me, one of the film's most powerful visual rhythms. And it wasn't only the landscapes themselves but the way they shifted with mood. When the story leaned into joy, the skies opened wide, saturated with light, the greens of the grass so vivid they seemed to hum. But when danger or grief entered, the very same places seemed to change. Shadows crept longer. Fog swallowed coastlines whole. I love when cinematography does that, when the weather and lighting seem to mirror inner life. It feels deeply human because don't we all experience the world that way? A sunny day can feel like paradise or like mockery depending on what we're carrying inside. The village itself fascinated me. It wasn't pristine. It wasn't some polished medieval fantasy with clean streets and glittering towers. It felt lived in, rugged, scarred by storms, patched together with effort and resilience. You could almost smell the smoke from the chimneys, hear the creak of wood that had been repaired a dozen times. For me, that authenticity gave the story weight. It reminded me of my grandmother's stories about her own village, how nothing was ever perfect, how survival itself was a kind of art. The production design seemed to echo that truth, beauty not as perfection, but as persistence. And then there were the skies. Oh, those skies. Few films have captured flight the way this one did. The cinematography leaned into long takes, following dragons and riders as they wove through clouds, dipped over cliffs, skimmed the surface of the ocean. There was a looseness to the camera, a kind of freedom that made me feel my stomach drop in sympathy, as though I were truly there. I remember as a child swinging as high as I could on a playground swing, closing my eyes, and pretending I was flying. Watching those scenes, I felt that same sensation again. Isn't it extraordinary when cinema revives not just images but sensations buried deep in us? The forests and caves offered another layer. If the skies were about openness and possibility, these spaces were about mystery, intimacy, even danger. The cinematography here pulled in closer, beams of light filtering through branches, sparks glowing against cave walls, reflections shimmering in underground pools. These moments reminded me of nights camping in the woods, where every crack of a twig carried both fear and wonder. What was out there in the dark? What stories were waiting just beyond sight? The film knew how to use those primal feelings, not only to create tension but to awaken awe. One of the most subtle but profound choices, I think, was the way the sea functioned. The ocean wasn't simply a boundary between lands, it was a presence, almost an antagonist. Always there, always shifting, sometimes calm, sometimes violent. The cinematography gave it weight. Waves weren't just background noise. They swallowed ships, roared against cliffs, reflected. Starlight with eerie calm. For me, the sea became a metaphor for everything uncontrollable, everything larger than human will. And that struck me because in life too, we're always negotiating with forces beyond us. Time, nature, loss. The sea carried that weight for the film, both beautiful and terrifying. And then there was fire. Not just literal fire, though the flames of dragon breath were rendered with stunning detail. The way heat distorted the air, the way embers drifted slowly after the initial burst. But also the symbolic use of fire in torches, in hearths, in moments of both destruction and warmth. Fire was chaos, yes, but it was also home. That duality resonated with me deeply, perhaps because I've always thought of fire as one of humanity's oldest metaphors. It destroys, but it also gathers us, lights our way, protects us. The film leaned into that paradox beautifully. What impressed me most, though, was how all these settings weren't static. They grew with the story. In the beginning, the village feels small, almost suffocating, hemmed in by cliffs and sea. But as the characters evolve, those same spaces open. The cliffs become launch points. The sea becomes a pathway. The caves become sanctuaries. It's as though the world itself was changing alongside the characters, or perhaps, more truthfully, the characters' perception of the world was changing, and we as viewers were invited into that transformation. That's one of the most powerful things setting can do, not just house a story, but evolve with it, shaping and reflecting growth. From a purely cinematic perspective, the choices in framing were extraordinary. Wide shots gave us grandeur, yes, but the film also knew when to go intimate, close-ups that lingered on faces, hands, even small objects. I remember one moment when the camera lingered on the reflection of a flame in a character's eyes, and that single detail conveyed more emotion than dialogue ever could. Those are the choices that make me trust a director, when they understand that sometimes less is more, that sometimes the smallest image carries the heaviest weight. Color, too, played a profound role. The palette shifted subtly across the story, cool blues and grays during moments of uncertainty, rich golds and reds during triumph, pale dawns during transitions. It reminded me of how painters use color not simply to depict but to evoke. Turner's skies, Van Gogh's fields, colors that don't just show us a scene but make us feel it. That's what the cinematography here achieved. What lingers with me most, though, is atmosphere. That elusive quality that isn't reducible to any single technique but arises from all of them together. Atmosphere is why you can close your eyes right now and remember how the film felt. Not what happened, not who said what, but the feeling of being there. For me, the atmosphere of this film was one of awe tinged with danger, beauty intertwined with loss. And that atmosphere came not from story alone but from the settings and cinematic choices that wrapped around it. I think that's why I keep returning to certain images in my mind. A dragon silhouetted against a blood-red sunset, a torch sputtering in a storm, the endless sea swallowing the horizon, the glow of firelight on a face torn between fear and love. These images have etched themselves into memory not because of plot, but because of the way place and image were woven together to become inseparable from emotion. And isn't that the gift of cinema at its best? To give us not only characters and stories, but worlds we feel we've truly inhabited, worlds we can return to in memory as easily as we return to childhood streets or long-lost landscapes. This film did that for me. It gave me a place as much as a story. And in some ways, that place has stayed with me, reshaping how I look at my own world, the cliffs and skies, the forests and seas I encounter in my own life. Because once you've flown across those skies, once you've walked those caves, once you've stared into that endless horizon, you carry them with you always. There's a kind of magic in stepping behind the curtain of any work of art. We often imagine films as arriving fully formed, perfectly polished, as though they've always existed in the exact shape we encounter them. But the truth, of course, is messier, and for me, infinitely more fascinating. Every sweeping shot we admire, every carefully crafted moment of tension or tenderness, hides behind it a story of human effort, of unexpected stumbles, of laughter and improvisation, of sheer persistence. That's what I find myself dwelling on when I think about how this film came into being. Not just the dragons or the drama, but the people who worked tirelessly to make every detail breathe. One of the first stories I came across about the production still makes me smile. Apparently, during the earliest days of shooting, the crew faced what seemed like a simple problem: fog. The coastal setting they'd chosen was breathtaking, with its sheer cliffs and roaring waves, but nature has its own temperament. On the very first morning of location filming, the cameras rolled out, the actors were in costume, the energy was high, and then, as if on cue, a dense fog rolled in off the sea. Not a romantic, cinematic mist, but a heavy, suffocating blanket of gray that swallowed everything. Hours ticked by with nothing visible beyond a few feet. And instead of despairing, the crew embraced it. They turned the downtime into bonding time. Actors and stunt performers huddled together, swapping stories, sharing tea, while the director paced like a restless poet waiting for the fog to lift. What I love about this anecdote isn't just the humor of it, it's how it shows that sometimes the film we see is shaped not just by vision but by weather, by waiting, by the patience of people willing to sit in the cold until the world cooperates. That spirit of patience carried through many aspects of filming. Flight sequences, for instance, were notoriously difficult to choreograph. We as viewers are swept away by those exhilarating scenes, the camera gliding through clouds, riders leaning into the wind, but behind them lay months of trial and error. I learned that the actors went through a sort of aerial boot camp, where they practiced for hours on mechanical rigs designed to simulate flight. Imagine being strapped into a machine that tilts, spins, and dives, all while you're supposed to act, deliver lines, and maintain the illusion of joy rather than nausea. More than one actor admitted, laughing later, that they came dangerously close to losing their breakfast mid-flight. But those very human struggles gave the sequences authenticity. When you see a rider gripping tightly, wide-eyed, there's a good chance part of that expression isn't acting, it's survival. I find it beautiful, really, how vulnerability often sneaks into art in ways no one plans. The director apparently encouraged the actors to lean into that, reminding them that real wonder often carries traces of fear. That's something I've always believed myself, that awe and terror are siblings, inseparable. Perhaps that's why those flying scenes resonate so deeply. They aren't polished stunts but layered with genuine human response. Another behind-the-scenes detail that fascinates me is the way the dragons themselves were brought to life. Of course, visual effects played a monumental role, with animators and designers working tirelessly to create creatures that felt both mythical and believable. But what many people don't realize is how physical the process was on set. To give the actors something to interact with, the crew built enormous practical rigs, foam molds shaped roughly like dragon necks or wings, covered in green screen material. Crew members would physically move these rigs, shifting them in ways meant to mimic a dragon's presence. The result? Actors delivering lines to what was essentially a giant sponge or a pool noodle. There's something so wonderfully absurd about imagining a serious, emotionally charged scene where a character whispers a farewell to their beloved dragon, while in reality, they're stroking a block of foam duct taped together. And yet, this absurdity bonded the cast. They often joked between takes, giving the foam dragons ridiculous nicknames, competing to see who could keep a straight face longest while interacting with them. These moments of silliness, I think, are what kept the intensity of production bearable. Because filming such an ambitious project is exhausting, long days, countless retakes, complex technical setups. Humor becomes survival. The crew, too, developed their own little rituals. One of my favorites is a story about the cinematographer, who apparently insisted on playing music between takes. Different songs for different scenes, sweeping orchestral scores for battle sequences, playful folk tunes for lighter moments, even rock ballads when energy was low. It became a way of shaping mood not only for the film but for the team itself. I think about that often. How art doesn't just happen on the screen, it happens in those in-between spaces, in the rhythms that carry people through exhaustion into creativity. Of course, not everything was laughter. There were challenges that nearly derailed entire sequences. One particularly tense moment came during the filming of a storm scene at sea. The production had built a massive water tank, complete with mechanical wave machines and wind turbines to simulate the chaos of an ocean storm. It was spectacular, but also terrifying. During one take, a malfunction caused the waves to surge higher than intended, nearly toppling a rig holding cameras and lights. Crew members rushed in, soaked and shivering, to secure everything. No one was seriously hurt, thankfully, but the moment left everyone shaken. Later, one of the actors described how that near accident changed the way they approached the scene. The fear they felt in that tank bled into their performance, lending it an authenticity that no amount of direction could have achieved. Moments like that remind me how fragile filmmaking is. We see the finished product and marvel at its seamlessness, but behind it lies 1,000 points where everything could have gone wrong. And it's the resilience of cast and crew, their ability to adapt, to turn crisis into creativity, that makes the art possible. Relationships among the cast were another layer of magic. From all accounts, there was a sense of genuine camaraderie on set. Younger cast members, especially, looked up to their more experienced counterparts, who often took them under their wing. One story I love involves a veteran actor quietly coaching a newcomer through a particularly emotional scene, not by lecturing but by sitting beside them, breathing with them, reminding them that vulnerability was not weakness but strength. The scene that emerged from that moment became one of the most poignant in the film. And knowing the care behind it, the generosity between actors, only deepens my appreciation for it. The crew wasn't immune to this sense of family either. Apparently, a tradition developed where, every Friday, different departments would host a small celebration. The costume team once baked dragon-shaped cookies. The lighting crew strung fairy lights around the base camp. These rituals may seem small, but in the grind of production, they created moments of joy, of humanity, of remembering why they were all there, to build something extraordinary together. And then there were the unplanned gifts. Animals, for instance, had a way of sneaking into production. On one occasion, a stray cat wandered onto the set and promptly refused to leave. Instead of shooing it away, the crew adopted it, giving it a little makeshift bed in the production office and dubbing it their unofficial mascot. The cat became a source of comfort, wandering freely between departments, curling up in laps, even wandering through background shots. I smile imagining audiences one day pausing the film and spotting a little cat tucked into the corner of a scene, a secret wink from the real world hiding inside the fantasy. All of this makes me think about how art is never just the vision of a single mind. We talk about directors, about writers, about stars, but films are mosaics, stitched together by hundreds of hands, thousands of decisions, countless small acts of persistence and creativity. The fog delays, the malfunctioning wave machines, the foam dragons, the Friday cookies, these aren't distractions from the art. They are the art in a way. They're the invisible foundation that makes the visible possible. And when I watch the film knowing these stories, it feels different. The skies aren't just skies, they're the result of actors fighting nausea on a mechanical rig. The emotional intimacy between characters isn't just performance, it's the generosity of one actor mentoring another. The storm at sea isn't just spectacle, it's real fear transformed into art. These layers enrich the experience for me, because they remind me that behind every moment of cinema lies humanity. Flawed, funny, fragile, resilient humanity. Perhaps that's why I love behind-the-scenes stories so much. They remind us that even the most fantastical worlds are built by human hands, shaped by laughter and mistakes, by late nights and small triumphs. And in that sense, the magic of filmmaking isn't separate from real life. It is real life, translated into image and sound.